Every morning at precisely 5:30, Camellia Rose awakened in her small apartment on the outskirts of the city. The alarm clock's harsh buzz cut through the darkness like a knife, but she never needed it really. Her body had learned to wake. Naturally, conditioned by 3 years of the same routine, 3 years of serving in the grandest mansion in Willowbrook Hills, where money flowed like water and luxury was simply a way of life. As she sat on the edge of her narrow bed, Camellia's fingers automatically reached for the long, flowing dress that hung carefully on her closet door. Navy blue with tiny white flowers, it fell gracefully to her ankles, concealing everything beneath with deliberate precision. This wasn't just clothing to her, it was armor, protection, a carefully constructed shield that kept her deepest secret hidden from the world. The fabric felt familiar against her fingers as she slipped it over her head, smoothing every wrinkle with practiced movements. Each morning brought the same ritual, the same careful attention to ensuring every inch of her legs remained covered. The dress wasn't chosen for fashion or comfort, but for necessity. Beneath that flowing fabric lay a truth so painful, so shameful. In her mind, that she would rather endure anything than let another soul witness it. Camellia caught her reflection in the small, cracked mirror beside her bed. At 23, she possessed a natural beauty that no amount of hard work could diminish. Her dark hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders, and her green eyes held a depth that spoke of wisdom gained through suffering. But those same eyes carried shadows, memories that haunted her dreams and shaped every decision she made. The bus ride to Willowbrook Hills took exactly 1 hour and 15 minutes. Camellia always sat in the same seat, 3 rows from the back, where she could observe without being noticed. During this daily journey, she would lose herself in books borrowed from the local library, classic novels that transported her mind. 2 worlds far removed from her current reality. Literature had become her escape, her education, and her secret passion, as the modest neighborhoods gave way to manicured lawns and towering gates. Camellia felt the familiar tightening in her chest. The contrast between her world and Theodore Ashworth's was stark and undeniable. His mansion stood like a monument to success, with its marble columns, pristine gardens, and luxury cars that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Theodore Ashworth was 35 years old and had built a technology empire from nothing. The media called him a genius, a visionary who had revolutionized online communication platforms. But to Camellia, he was simply her employer, distant, polite, and completely unaware of her existence beyond her function as household staff. She had watched him for 3 years, noting his rigid schedule, his expensive suits, his phone calls that moved millions of dollars with simple yes or no answers. He was everything she was not: privileged, powerful, and seemingly untouchable by the kind of tragedy that had shaped her life. Mrs. Evangeline, the head housekeeper, greeted Camellia at the servants' entrance as always. The older woman had become something of a mother figure, offering warmth and understanding in a house that often felt cold despite its luxury. She was the only person who knew fragments of Camellia's story, though not the complete truth that lay hidden beneath those carefully chosen dresses. "Good morning, dear," Mrs. Evangeline said with her usual kind smile. "Mr. Ashworth has an important board meeting today, so he'll be leaving early. You'll have the house mostly to yourself for cleaning." Camellia nodded gratefully. She preferred working when Theodore was away. His presence made her nervous, not because he was unkind, but because she feared that somehow, some way, he might see through her carefully constructed facade. The mansion's interior was a masterpiece of design and wealth. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbows across marble floors, and priceless artwork adorned walls that stretched toward impossibly high ceilings. Each room was larger than Camellia's entire apartment, filled with furniture that cost more than she earned in several years, as she began her morning routine in the grand living room. Camellia's mind wandered to her sister Jasmine, at 19. Jasmine was everything Camellia had once dreamed of, being bright, ambitious, and full of hope for the future. She was studying nursing at the community college, working toward a career that would lift them both out of poverty. Every sacrifice Camellia made was for Jasmine. Every morning she spent cleaning other people's luxury was an investment in her sister's future. The shame she carried, the secret she protected so fiercely. All of it was bearable because it meant Jasmine could have the opportunities that tragedy had stolen from Camellia herself. The accident happened so suddenly that Camelia's mind couldn't process it until she was already falling. She had been cleaning the tall windows in Theodore's study, standing on the wooden stepladder that she used for high places. The ladder was older than she had realized, and when she reached for the top corner of the window, the wood simply gave. Way time seemed to slow as she felt herself falling backward. Her arms flailed desperately for something to grab, but found only air. The impact with the heavy oak desk was brutal and precise, striking her right leg at exactly the spot where old scars lay hidden. Beneath layers of fabric, the pain that shot through her body was unlike anything she had experienced since. The original injury 5 years ago, but worse than the physical agony, was the terror that flooded her mind as she realized her dress had shifted, torn, revealing the very thing she had spent years hiding. "Please don't lift my dress," she begged frantically as she heard footsteps, rushing toward the study. Her voice carried a desperation that came from the deepest part of her soul, a terror of exposure that went far beyond modesty. But Theodore Ashworth had already appeared in the doorway, drawn by the crash and her cry of pain. For 3 years, he had seen her as part of the household machinery, efficient, quiet, and unremarkable. Now, seeing her crumpled on his study floor, something fundamental shifted in his perception. Without hesitation, he knelt beside her, his expensive suit forgotten as it touched the dusty floor. His trained mind, so accustomed to solving complex business problems, immediately assessed the situation. She was hurt, possibly seriously, and needed immediate medical attention. "I'm calling an ambulance," he said, reaching for his phone. "No, please," Camellia whispered, her voice thick with pain and panic. "I can't afford. I'll be fine. Just help me stand." For the first time in 3 years, Theodore really looked at her. He saw beyond the uniform, beyond the role she played in his household, and glimpsed the person beneath. The fear in her eyes wasn't just about physical pain. It was something deeper, more complex. "Don't worry about the cost," he said gently. "I'll handle everything. But first, I need to see how badly you're hurt." It was then that his eyes fell upon what Camellia had fought so desperately to hide. The fabric of her dress had torn during the fall, revealing an intricate web of scars that covered her right leg from thigh to ankle. The marks told a story of trauma so severe that Theodore's breath caught in his throat. These weren't small scars from a minor accident. They were the evidence of something catastrophic, something that had required multiple surgeries and left permanent damage. The careful way they had healed, some better than others, suggested medical care that had been interrupted or inadequate. "My God," he whispered, not in disgust or shock, but in dawning understanding. "What happened to you?" Camelia's response was to curl into herself, trying desperately to cover the scars that had shaped her entire adult life. The shame that flooded through her was almost unbearable. For 3 years, she had successfully hidden this part of herself, maintaining the illusion that she was just a normal young woman working to support her family. Now, in one terrible moment, everything was exposed. The carefully constructed walls she had built around her vulnerability lay in ruins. Leaving her more naked than if she had been without clothes entirely, Theodore found himself in completely uncharted territory. In his world of board meetings, in billion-dollar decisions, he had never encountered raw human vulnerability like this. The woman he had barely noticed for 3 years was revealing depths of pain and strength that humbled him. "I'm going to help you," he said quietly, his voice carrying a certainty that surprised him. "We're going to take care of this properly." As he carefully helped her to a more comfortable position, avoiding any contact with her injured leg, Theodore realized that everything he thought he knew about his household, about the people who worked for him, had been an illusion. Camellia Rose was not just his maid. She was a person with a story, with secrets, a strength that had allowed her to work through pain that would have stopped most people entirely. The accident that had seemed like a disaster was actually a revelation, stripping away pretense and forcing both of them to confront truths they had been avoiding. For Camellia, it meant the end of her carefully maintained secret. For Theodore, it was the beginning of seeing the world through completely different eyes. Neither of them could have predicted that this moment of crisis would become the foundation for something that would transform both their lives forever. The ambulance ride to the hospital felt like a journey between two different worlds. Camelia sat rigid on the stretcher, her torn dress carefully arranged by the paramedics to preserve her modesty, while Theodore rode beside her in his expensive suit, looking completely out of place in the medical vehicle. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken questions and the weight of secrets finally exposed. Dr. Harrison Blake, Theodore's personal physician, met them at the emergency entrance. He was a distinguished man in his 50s who had treated the wealthy elite for decades. But the sight of Camelia's extensive scarring gave him pause. As he examined her leg, his professional demeanor couldn't entirely mask his concern. "Our old injuries?" Dr. Blake said quietly to Theodore, while Camelia received pain medication. "Very extensive trauma, probably from a serious accident. The scarring suggests she never received proper reconstructive surgery. The healing was improvised." Theodore felt something cold settle in his stomach. For 3 years, this young woman had been working in his house, climbing ladders, carrying heavy cleaning supplies, all while dealing with what must have been chronic pain from poorly healed injuries. The dedication it must have taken, the sheer determination to push through discomfort every single day, humbled him completely. When the immediate medical crisis was handled, and Camelia was resting in a private room that Theodore had insisted on paying for, he finally asked the question that had been burning in his mind since the accident. "Will you tell me what happened to you?" Camelia stared out the hospital window for a long moment, watching the city bustle below. The medication had dulled the physical pain, but it couldn't touch the emotional ache that came with having her most carefully guarded secret exposed. Finally, she began to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was 5 years ago. 18, just graduated from high school with plans to study literature in college. My parents had saved money for my education, and everything seemed perfect. We were driving home from my graduation dinner when a drunk driver ran a red light." Theodore found himself leaning forward, drawn into her story despite himself. I thought a woman he had seen as just another employee was revealing herself to be someone who had survived something unimaginable. "The car hit us on my side," Camelia continued, her hands unconsciously smoothing the hospital blanket. "My parents were killed. Instantly. I was trapped in the wreckage for hours before the rescue teams could get me out. My right leg was destroyed. Bones shattered, muscles torn, nerves damaged." The clinical way she described her trauma spoke of someone who had learned to distance herself from the horror of it. Theodore realized he was witnessing incredible strength, disguised as simple storytelling. "I spent 8 months in the hospital. 3 surgeries to save my leg, countless hours of physical therapy. But the insurance only covered so much, and there was no money for the cosmetic surgery that would have made the scars less visible. When I finally got out, I was alone with my sister Jasmine to care for and medical bills that seemed impossible to pay." Mrs. Evangeline appeared in the doorway, having rushed to the hospital as soon as Theodore called her. Her face was etched with concern as she approached Camelia's bedside. This kind woman had suspected there was pain in Camelia's past, but hearing the full story brought tears to her eyes. "You never said anything, dear?" Mrs. Evangeline said softly, taking Camelia's hand. "All this time, you've been carrying this alone." Camelia's composure finally cracked. The tears she had held back for years began to flow as she found herself surrounded by unexpected kindness. "I couldn't tell anyone. The scars are so ugly, so horrible. I was afraid that if people knew, they would see me differently, pity me, or be disgusted." Theodore felt something shift fundamentally in his chest. The successful businessman who had built his life on logic and calculated decisions found himself confronted with emotions he hadn't experienced in years. This wasn't just sympathy for an employee who had suffered tragedy. This was something deeper, more personal. "Camelia," he said gently, "you are one of the strongest people I have ever met. What you've accomplished taking care of your sister, working despite your pain, never complaining or asking for help, that's not something to be ashamed of. That's heroic." The word heroic hung in the air between them. Camelia had never thought of herself as anything other than someone doing what was necessary to survive. But seeing herself reflected in Theodore's eyes, she began to understand that her daily courage was indeed extraordinary. Over the next few hours, as Camelia rested and Theodore handled the medical arrangements, more of her story emerged. Told them about Jasmine, who was now 19 and studying nursing with dreams of helping others the way doctors had helped Camellia. Every dollar Camellia earned went toward her sister's education and their modest living expenses. She doesn't know the full extent of my injuries, Camellia admitted. I've always worn long clothes around her, told her the scars weren't that bad. I didn't want her to feel guilty about me working so hard for her education. Theodore found himself thinking about his own privileged upbringing, his easy path to success, and the way he had taken for granted every advantage he had been given. Camelia's sacrifice for her sister's future put his own achievements in stark perspective. As evening approached, Dr. Blake returned with test results and recommendations. The fall had aggravated old injuries, and Camellia would need several weeks of rest and physical therapy to recover properly. More concerning was his observation that she'd been masking chronic pain for years. Your leg never healed correctly, Dr. Blake explained gently. You've been walking on bones that didn't set properly, muscles that had to compensate for nerve damage. It's remarkable that you functioned as well as you have, but you need proper treatment. The look of panic that crossed Camelia's face was immediate and intense. Weeks away from work meant no income, which meant Jasmine's college expenses couldn't be met. The careful financial balance she had maintained for years would collapse. I can't afford to miss work, she said, trying to sit up despite the pain. Jasmine's tuition is due next month, and we have rent, food, everything depends on my job. Theodore had been listening to this conversation with growing amazement and frustration. Here was a young woman who had survived tragedy that would have broken most people, who had sacrificed her own dreams to ensure her sister could pursue education, and who was now worried about missing work while injured. You don't need to worry about money, he said firmly. I'm going to make sure you get the treatment you need, and your sister's education will be taken care of. Camelia's eyes widened with something approaching panic. I can't accept charity. I've never taken handouts, and I won't start now. I work for what I have. The pride in her voice was unmistakable, and Theodore realized he was dealing with someone whose dignity was as important to her as survival itself. This wasn't about money to Camellia. It was about maintaining the self-respect that had carried her through years of hardship. Then work for me in a different capacity, Theodore said, the idea forming even as he spoke. I need someone to manage my personal library, catalog my book collection, help with research for my foundation work. Someone with your intelligence and literary background would be perfect. Mrs. Evangeline smiled knowingly from her chair beside the bed. She had seen the way Theodore looked at Camellia during her story, had noticed the transformation in his usual distant demeanor. Something was happening between these two people that went beyond employer and employee relationships. As night fell over the city, Camellia found herself in completely unfamiliar territory. For 5 years, she had built her identity around being invisible, around hiding her pain and managing everything alone. Now she was being seen, really seen, by people who seemed to value her for exactly who she was, scars and all. The conversation that continued into the evening revealed more about both Camellia and Theodore than either had expected to share. She learned that behind his success lay his own loneliness, his own struggles with finding authentic connections in a world where people often wanted something from him. He discovered that her love of literature matched his own, that her insights into classic works were as sophisticated as any professor he had known. When visiting hours ended and Theodore finally prepared to leave, he paused at Camelia's bedside. The woman lying there was no longer his maid, could never be just his employee again. She had become someone whose strength inspired him, whose vulnerability touched something deep in his heart that he had thought was closed off forever. Rest. Now, he said softly. Tomorrow, we'll start figuring out how to build something better for both of us. As Camellia watched him leave, she realized that the accident that had seemed like a disaster might actually be the beginning of something she had never dared to dream possible. For the first time in 5 years, she wasn't facing her challenges alone. 3 weeks later, Camellia found herself in a reality she could never have imagined. Instead of cleaning Theodore's study, she now worked in it as his personal research assistant and library curator. The transformation felt surreal, like stepping from one life into another, entirely different existence. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows as she carefully cataloged rare first editions. Her injured leg propped on a cushioned stool that Theodore had personally selected for her. Comfort. Dr. Blake's treatment plan was working wonderfully, but more than physical healing was taking place in that elegant room. Theodore had converted a section of his study into a comfortable workspace for Camellia, complete with a desk position to take advantage of the natural light she loved for reading. Every detail showed thoughtful consideration for her needs and preferences. From the ergonomic chair that supported her healing leg to the small refrigerator stocked with her favorite tea. "How are you feeling today?" Theodore asked as he entered the study with his morning coffee, a question that had become their daily ritual. "Much better," Camellia replied, looking up from the manuscript she was examining. "Dr. Blake says the physical therapy is ahead of schedule. My leg is actually feeling better than it has in years." What she didn't say, but what Theodore could see in her eyes, was that more than her leg was healing, the constant tension she had carried for years was slowly leaving her shoulders. The shadows under her eyes were fading. For the first time since her accident, Camellia was learning what it felt like to live without constant worry about money, about hiding her scars, about managing everything alone. Jasmine had visited several times, initially suspicious of her sister's sudden change in circumstances. The 19-year-old nursing student was protective of Camellia and worried that accepting help from a wealthy employer might come with strings attached. But Theodore's genuine respect for her sister and his sincere interest in Jasmine's studies had gradually won her over. "He's different than I expected," Jasmine had confided to Camellia during her last visit. "Rich people usually treat us like we're invisible, but he actually listens when I talk about my classes. And the way he looks at you." She had left the sentence unfinished, but her knowing smile said everything. Mrs. Evangeline had become an enthusiastic supporter of the evolving relationship between Theodore and Camellia. The older woman had worked for wealthy families for decades and had developed a sharp eye for authentic emotion versus superficial attraction. What she saw developing between her former cleaning colleague and her employer was something rare and genuine. "That man has been sleepwalking through life for years," she told Camellia one afternoon while bringing lunch to the study. "Since his divorce, he's been all business, no heart. You've awakened something in him that I wasn't sure still existed." Camelia's feelings were more complicated. The gratitude she felt toward Theodore was immense, but she struggled with uncertainty about his motivations. Was his kindness born from pity? Was she simply a charity case that made him feel good about himself? The insecurity that came from years of hiding her perceived flaws made it difficult to believe that someone like Theodore could genuinely care. For someone like her, these doubts came to a head one evening when Theodore found her working late in the study, tears streaming down her face as she read a particularly beautiful passage from a poetry collection. "Camellia, what's wrong?" he asked, immediately moving to her side with concern. "I don't belong here," she whispered, gesturing around the elegant room. "This beautiful place, these expensive books, this comfortable life, I'm just the maid who got hurt. I don't deserve any of this." Theodore knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his with a gentleness that had become natural between them. "Over the past weeks, look at me," he said softly. When she finally met his eyes, she saw something there that took her breath away. It wasn't pity or charity or even simple kindness. It was love, unmistakable and profound. "You think I'm helping you out of guilt or obligation?" Theodore said, his voice steady and certain, "but you're wrong. Everything I've done because somewhere in the past few weeks I've fallen completely in love with you." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Camellia stared at him, searching his face for any sign of deception or temporary emotion. "But I'm nobody," she protested. "I'm a maid with ugly scars and no education and no family worth mentioning. Could have anyone." "I don't want anyone," Theodore replied firmly. "I want you. I want your intelligence that sees beauty in literature most people find boring. I want your strength that carried you through tragedy that would have destroyed me. I want your heart that sacrificed everything for your sister's future. I want your courage that got up every morning and worked through pain I can't even imagine." Paused, his thumb gently stroking across her scarred hand. "Your scars don't make you ugly, Camellia. They make you magnificent. They're proof of what you survived, what you overcame. They're beautiful because they're part of you." The kiss that followed was soft and tentative, full of wonder and discovery. For Camellia, it was the first time anyone had touched her with complete knowledge of her scars, her past, her struggles. and chosen to love her not despite these things, but because of how they had shaped her into who she was. When they broke apart, both were crying. Years of loneliness, of hiding, of believing themselves unworthy of love, were washing away in that single moment of connection. "I love you too," Camellia whispered, the words feeling foreign and wonderful on her tongue. "I've been fighting it for weeks because I was so afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Afraid that if I let myself hope for this, for happiness, for love, something would happen to take it away again. I've lost so much." Theodore pulled her closer, mindful of her healing leg. "We've both lost things, but maybe what we've found together is worth all the pain that brought us here." The weeks that followed were a time of careful discovery and growing confidence. Theodore introduced Camellia to his social circle gradually, proudly presenting her as his research assistant and companion. Some people were surprised by the relationship, but those who mattered most could see the genuine happiness that radiated from both of them. Jasmine thrived under the security that Theodore's support provided. With her tuition worries eliminated, she threw herself into her nursing studies with renewed energy. More importantly, she watched her sister blossom into someone she had never seen before, confident, relaxed, genuinely happy. "You're different now," Jasmine told Camellia during one of their weekend dinners together. "You used to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders. Now you look free." Mrs. Evangeline had been promoted to head of household staff, a position that came with a substantial raise and the satisfaction of seeing two people she cared about find happiness together. She often smiled to herself as she watched Theodore and Camellia work side by side in the study, their heads bent over books, their easy conversation flowing between literature and life. The physical transformation in Camellia was remarkable, but the emotional transformation was even more dramatic. Under Dr. Blake's continued care, her leg healed better than anyone had expected. The chronic pain that had been her constant companion for years diminished, significantly with proper treatment. But more than that, she began to see herself through Theodore's eyes. The scars she had hidden so carefully became simply part of her story, no more shameful than any other chapter in her life. She started wearing dresses that showed her arms, skirts that didn't hide her ankles, clothes chosen for beauty rather than concealment. 6 months after the accident that had changed everything, Theodore proposed in the very study where their love had grown. Surrounded by the books that had been their first shared passion, he offered her not just his heart, but a future built on mutual respect. It's a genuine partnership and love that had been tested by truth. "I know this seems fast," he said as he knelt beside her chair with a ring that sparkled like captured starlight. "But I've spent 35 years not knowing what I was looking for. Now I know I was looking for you." Camelia's answer was immediate and certain. "Yes," she said, laughing through tears of joy. "Yes to everything. Yes to love. Yes to partnership. Yes to building something beautiful together." Their wedding 6 months later was a celebration that bridged two worlds. Jasmine served as maid of honor, radiant in her nursing school. Graduation gown, she had accelerated her studies and graduated early. Mrs. Evangeline cried through the entire ceremony, proud of the young woman she had watched transform from a frightened maid into a confident bride. The vows they exchanged were personal and profound. Speaking not just of love but of the journey that had brought them together, Theodore promised to always see her strength rather than her scars, to support her dreams rather than diminish them. Camellia promised to trust in their love, to believe in her own worth, and to build a future that honored both their individual strengths and their shared dreams as they danced at their reception. Camellia caught sight of herself in one of the ballroom mirrors. She was wearing a beautiful gown that showed her scars proudly, her head held high, her face glowing with happiness. The frightened young woman who had begged, "Please don't lift my dress," was gone, replaced by someone who had learned that true love sees all wounds and chooses to heal rather than judge. "What are you thinking about?" Theodore asked, following her gaze to the mirror. "I'm thinking about how sometimes the worst moments of our lives lead us to the best," she replied. "If I hadn't fallen that day, if my dress hadn't torn, if you hadn't seen my scars, I would have spent the rest of my life missing the most important person I would ever meet," Theodore finished. "Our scars tell the story of where we've been, Camellia, but our love tells the story of where we're going." A future stretched before them, full of possibilities neither had dared to dream. Theodore's foundation would fund scholarships for young people like Jasmine, who had overcome adversity to pursue education. Camellia would oversee the literary programs, using her own story to inspire others who felt invisible or unworthy. Together, they had learned that love isn't about hiding our wounds, but about finding someone who sees them as proof, our strength to survive and thrive. In a world that often values surface beauty over substantial character, they had discovered something rare and precious, a love built on truth, tested by adversity, and strengthened by the courage to be completely, authentically themselves. The maid who had hidden her scars had become a woman who wore them as badges of honor. The millionaire who had lived behind walls of privilege had found someone who taught him the true meaning of wealth. And in their love story, two broken people had become whole, not by hiding their damages, but by choosing to heal together. Their happily ever after wasn't perfect, but it was real, honest, and beautiful in all the ways that matter most. Love, they had learned, doesn't require perfection. It requires truth, courage, the willingness to see beauty in unexpected places. And